So I'm Peter, and I'm a sinner. But by God's grace, that has changed from being my weakness to being my great strength. I'm going to tell you some more about that, which is why I'm here. Normally, or in my everyday job, I help private companies build their brand. So I work in a kind of a totally secular circumstance. But Jesus changed my heart, so now I'm changing my directions. But I previously worked at a large PR agency in Oslo, the capital of Norway, and we actually had the Church of Norway as one of our clients. And I was assigned as the project leader for a big PR campaign for them towards the broad Norwegian public. And so to understand their current kind of reputation-related situation, I needed to do some analysis to know kind of what's the situation right now. So as I normally do, I performed a comprehensive media analysis, studying the media appearances from the Church of Norway towards the broader Norwegian public for the last 2 years. And then after I did the analysis, I made a top 5 list over the topics that the Church of Norway has communicated the most toward the broader Norwegian audience the last 2 years. On the top of that list at that time was climate and the environment, followed by asylum and refugee policies. On the third place on that time was same-sex marriage and LGBT relationships, followed by internal church bureaucratic reforms, and then finally on the 5th place was oil and gas exploration areas in the northern region. This is Norway, Church of Norway, kind of a liberal fraction of the church. And here I was like a fresh Christian PR guy. I was amazed. I was partly shocked. I thought, this is an organization that has managed in some way to organize itself away from its core message, the reason it exists, and the unique value proposition to the broader audience. I was amazed. And then I did an analysis of the website of the Church of Norway, and I couldn't find Jesus. I couldn't find Jesus on the main website of the Norwegian church. That isn't entirely true because I scrolled down towards the bottom and eventually I found Jesus. But it was really hard. It was really hard. I really had to search. And I found that to be strange because people today aren't less spiritual than they used to be. In fact, there are many signs that people are more spiritually curious now than they have been for a long time. But in the age of individualism, even churches, at least the Church of Norway, seems to believe that people no longer care about spiritual need. What if that isn't true? What if the problem isn't that people don't care? What if the problem is that the church is telling a story that people don't want to be part of? And most people today do not associate the church with the brand of radical love and surprising grace that Jesus gave us and that he asked of us to manage in a world that desperately craves radical love and surprising grace. So I come here as a PR guy, as a marketer. That's what I know. That's my profession. I am no theologian. I'm not going to pretend to be either. But I want to challenge you. You come from vastly different traditions. So it's hard for me to I know the Norwegian culture, the Norwegian backgrounds. But hopefully I think this will apply to your country and your setting as well. But when I challenge you, please know that it's done out of love. Because my big dream has become for Jesus to be radically rediscovered in our time. And I think he will be. When I talk about the church, and I use the term church, I mean church in broadly, like the Lutheran church, the Catholic church, the Pentecostal movement, the mission church. I mean church in general. Okay? So I believe the church with a big C, manages the world's most important message. God became human. He stepped into our reality, showing us radical love that burst into a merciless world and forever changed human lives and societies. Jesus and his followers became the most prominent force for good that the world has ever seen. And he's the most influential person in the history. He's the kind of the main character in the best-selling book of all time. And we even count our time after Jesus, right? So, but seemingly people in the Western world don't care about that man today. I think it's a mystery. And I worked in communication and marketing for more than 20 years now. I know that all compelling communication in some way manages to connect with real concerns, real problems, real longings that people relate to, that people recognize. So when most people, at least in Norway, close their ears when the church talks, that is a real sign that the church doesn't understand good enough most people's real concerns, real longings, real dreams today. It's said, in short, the church has a branding problem. At least that's what I'm going to argue, make an argument for today. It is said, what is a brand? I don't know if you use that term very often in this setting. I do it all the time. I see the world through brands. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I do. I'm so trained in it. As it's said that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. That is the essence of your brand. So everybody has a brand. The only thing is whether you are in charge of forming your brand or not. Somebody else will if you don't. So a strong brand has a good alignment between what you promise and what people actually perceive you to be. If you have a strong alignment, you have a strong brand and people can trust you. So this is where I think the church has missed the mark and the church needs rebranding. But remember this today, after today, the church's decline is not inevitable. I don't believe in that story of the church's inevitable decline. But, and I saw this poster in the stairways here. I don't know the organization. It said, we're not living in a post-Christian society, but we live in a pre-revival society. That might be true. But if you want people to join your movement, you have to tell them a story they actually want to be part of, like Jesus did. And right now, it seems non-church organizations are telling stories people would rather be part of, whether it's Hollywood, new spiritual movements, or different online phenomena. So what I want to spend the rest of the time here, before we have some Q&A, is to try to give an answer to that question: how do you make the church relevant again for modern audiences? We need a plan, always need a plan. I'm actually going to cover number 1 and 2 now. I'm going to leave number 3 for after the break. And then I also prepared a couple of exercises connected to that strategy when we talk about the solution. All right, so, but first I want to talk about how did we end up in our current position. Why is there such a big gap between how we experience the deep, meaningful essence of our faith and how we are perceived from people from the outside? Why is there such a gap? And then afterwards I want to talk about 2 ditches, communication ditches, that I believe the church in general have fallen into, that we need to come out of in order to get back on the road. And then thirdly, in the next section, I'll outline a 3-step strategy to get back on track. I grew up in a Christian prayer house culture in Norway, in the southern part of Norway, in the fringes of the Bible Belt. It was a classic either-or culture. But in my generation, like most of the other kids, I've covered most of the Bible stories. I've sung songs where God was the driver and Jesus the conductor. And like most of the kids, like in my local community, we actually got some decent teachings in the kind of the basic of Christianity. So we knew about the basics. But like so many others in my generation, as a young adult, I chose to leave that narrative. Most of us did. Stories that mainstream culture offered me to understand my life to live in, was far more attractive than what I was offered in church. I moved to Oslo, the capital of Norway. I got good grades at university. I got a cool job. Life smiled down on me. I even was the lead guitar player in a rock band, playing on scenes in Oslo. I was in good shape at the time. And my friends, they started to call me Party Peter. Gradually, I began to live an extremely egocentric lifestyle. I got high on my success, well aided by my generation's big narrative that the meaning of life is to exploit or realize your unique potential. I mean, that was a common agreement between me and my friends. This is the meaning of life. And I thought I managed to live out that purpose. I sometimes started behaving like a jerk toward others, lying, manipulating, having cover stories to adjust things to my agenda. Because when the project is to realize me, in my case, Project Peter, you can't always let people too close into your life because they see things, they can see things you try to hide, things that is a little bit you're ashamed of, things that doesn't match your preformed image, right? And that is a accelerating tendency. You have to keep people more and more at a distance. Showing the real truth about yourself is too painful. You can flee from yourself year after year. I don't know what strategies you have for doing that. One of my strategies was using alcohol. The problem was over time, I felt like I were two different people. I had a little sensitive boy from my little small community in Norway, who wanted to be good, and then they had the ego-driven alter ego Party Peter, who was realizing actually himself in Oslo and actually succeeding. And then when you have these two kind of personalities within one body, self-hatred started to occur. I developed a profound contempt for myself and eventually self-hatred. I noticed that I started to lose control of my life, and I had chosen to live in a universe without God. So who is responsible for fixing things? Me. Who else? So I went all in fixing myself. And I started because when you're having a lot of anxiety and you feel like inside, your shoulders rise, your breathing is not very calm. So I need to start with trying to establish some inner peace. So I signed up for a mindfulness course. I bought this yoga mattress, rolled it out on the floor in the middle of Oslo. Lying there, I see this very clear in my head. I lie there in the midst of a bunch of mid-aged elderly women trying to establish some inner peace. I never had such tense breathing as I had in that room. It was awful. I couldn't even manage to breathe. So I thought, okay, Peter, you have been thinking like a loser. You have been thinking pessimistic or negative. You have to think like a winner. You have to think like a warrior. There was a lot of books, online courses offering me techniques to do just that. I didn't manage to think like a warrior. So another defeat. And then the panic rises. I'm not able to fix myself. And the anxiety keeps rising. I tried everything diet, training regimes, saying positive things to myself in the mirror every morning, trying to write 3 things I'm grateful for every evening, power posing, you name it. But the anxiety and the shame and the guilt that I was trying to get rid of, or at least balance, only grew. And finally, that's when I hit the moment of absolute defeat, when I hit rock bottom, when I finally gave up, that's when the change started. I said one late evening, I was working at the parliament in Norway as a political advisor. I was working for the former prime minister of Norway. She didn't know how I felt inside. My inner pain was so severe that I thought, I can't live like this. I cannot live like this. So I picked up the phone and I called AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And then I was invited to a meeting the day after, and I showed up there. That was actually in the basement of a church in Oslo. And that is the most evangelical congregation I've ever been a part of. I've never experienced something like that before or after. What did we all have in common around that table in the basement of that church in Oslo? We were gathered because we had failed, and finally we had admitted that we had failed. That's the reason why we gathered around that table. And then something magical happened in that room. We were all equal. Like for real, equal. You know the ranking, the pecking order that we rank each other in every other part of society, that was gone in that room. And then the door stood wide open for what I later came to know is grace. The most life-transforming phenomenon of all. And Christianity's core message. We were just a bunch of repentant sinners who just hoped for a chance at redemption. And I had an encounter with God who is exactly like the father who comes running towards the youngest son in the parable of the prodigal son. It's a story about grace, and that is a story I want to be part of. This is me telling parts of this story in a kind of a what is forkynnelse in English? Yeah, in a non-preaching way, because that is I would be not allowed to stand on the TEDx stage if I was preaching, but I wasn't, because it's totally possible to tell this story about the core message of the gospel without preaching, because this is something that this is something that every human being can relate to. So we don't have to use like Christian words. We could use that as well, and we should use the Christian terms, but we don't have to. So this is me trying to explain the core message of the gospel without preaching. And when I first crashed, I quickly understood that if I was going to be free, like really free, I needed to own up to my mistakes and dare to face my tendency towards evil, which is pretty well, I have a good tendency to that. Like you have. We all have. So I went on a forgiveness road trip, and I wrote down on a piece of paper every person I knew I had hurt and lied to and created cover stories for, and then I drove around on an actual road trip to seek forgiveness, ask for forgiveness. No guarantee, but I had to ask, I had to own up to my mistakes, take my responsibility. During this period, I also began reading the Bible, and what was previously dull and dry words suddenly spoke into my everyday life. I'd never seen a book like transform in such a way, ever. For the first time, God spoke to me for several months. One sentence circled in my head. Peter, I'm teaching you how to love yourself. And for me, that was the key. I had to learn to, at least a little bit, find some positive things about myself in order for me to be able to love others. And God, by His grace, created that in me. So, boundary breaking and life transforming grace is the church's original message, but few people associate it with the church or Christians. Where did we lose it? What went wrong? Why isn't the church more like an AA meeting? Back to the plan. And now I'm really going to dig into my PR world. I would like to mention three main reasons why I think that the church, at least temporarily, because I think it's temporarily, not lasting, have a reputation problem. The first reason for the reputation crisis is how Christians are portrayed in the media. We live in an attention economy, as you all know, and the dominant business models on the internet reward polarization. So the more extreme content means more views and more money. This has had, in my opinion, a double negative effect for the church in broad. Firstly, because the general public has been presented with a more extreme version of Christianity that even most Christian leaders don't recognize. And secondly, because we also have a tendency to end up in our echo chambers, a kind of a Christian echo chambers, where we lose or at least weaken our ability to see the world from a perspective other than our own. That's not a good basis for good relationships and conversations with other people, right? So some time ago, a church leader told me she was so tired of Christian Norway always being represented by oddballs or kind of weirdos on television. I said to her, yeah, that's right. But the reason is because there are no voices like yours, moderate and wise, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. That is a communication problem. That is something we can do something with. We must use today's communication channels to convey the world's most important message, the gospel. The second reason, I believe, for the church weakening is that large parts of the population perceive Christians as hypocrites or having double standards. Unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of Christian leaders having double standards and who have spread hate in the name of love, who have exploited positions of power to manipulate other people, or who literally have been caught with their pants down. Christians who become high on themselves, who walk in ego's power, which is our default. This is really our default. And not in the power of grace, are just as vulnerable, if not more, to derailing as anyone else. Egil Svartdal, he's a prominent Norwegian evangelist, that's a hard word, and TV pastor. He told me that the two most common objections against Christians that he meets when he travels around Norway is that they think they're better than others and they look down on others. Not exactly the brand we would like for people to perceive, right? But he suggested that the underlying cause might be that when Christians discuss sin, which is a core concept of the Christian story, we tend to focus on others' sins more than on our own. By presenting ourselves as holier than we are, people don't grasp that we too are sinners that are absolutely dependent on God's grace. And Philip Yancey, do anyone know him? Writer. He said, Christians get very angry toward other Christians who sin differently than they do. The Catholic thinker G.K. Chesterton, he was once asked or challenged by a newspaper to answer the question, what is wrong with the world? That is a big question. What is wrong with the world? And this is roughly 100 years ago, so the correspondence went by mail or letter, and he responded, very brief, "Dear sirs, I am. Sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." Now, that is one who really understood the gospel, in my opinion. Or like John Ortberg used to say in his podcasts, "My mess is my message." The perception of Christians as hypocrites is reinforced by media reality. This isn't a problem with the gospel or what we have to offer. This is a communication problem. Think about Paul. He's my idol. He's my hero. Besides Jesus, Paul is my hero. He was an Orthodox Pharisee, and then Jesus shone on his life, exposing the double standards and his self-righteousness. And then Paul was allowed to learn that power is made perfect in weakness and that my grace is sufficient for you. And he became a really great communicator of the gospel, didn't he? He was so clear about the roles of him and his Savior. And yeah, those who know they have been given forgiveness are more likely to love others openly and frequently. That applies to everyone. To communicate grace, we must live in it ourselves. No one can give away something we don't have ourselves. Or Timothy Keller used to say, the prerequisite for receiving grace is to know you need it. The last reason, I believe, is indifference based on an unclear core message from the church over time. The biggest crisis for the church today, I don't think, is like I don't think the biggest challenge is an active resistance, like it was in the early 2000s, like with the new atheism and stuff. Once they had established that God is dead, and then people started, so what? And then the whole excitement dropped because they didn't have an alternative story to offer, right? So that is not a challenge for us anymore, I believe. I think it's indifference. That's our challenge. Jesus isn't on the radar, and people see few, if any, connections between their everyday lives and the Christian faith. Generation Z is perhaps the first truly post-Christian generation or pre-revival generation in the Western world, in the sense that a large percentage of that generation lacks basic knowledge of the Bible, not to mention the gospel. In Europe and in the States, fewer people know why we celebrate Easter or the religious background for Easter. And in Norway, an Arcade, a national broadcaster, a year or two ago, published a large survey showing that 1 out of 10% of Norwegians believe that Jesus rose from the dead. 10%. A prominent church leader was offered a brilliant opportunity to, during Easter last year, to communicate the core message of Christianity to the Norwegian public. The reporter pointed out that Norwegian people increasingly don't believe that Jesus rose physically from the dead and that the resurrection is an actual historical event. And then he asked, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? That's a really easy question to answer for a church leader. That is the easiest questions of all. In fact, if I was a PR advisor for that church leader, and I had one question I could actually sell into the reporter, that would be the question. It's my dream question. So, lots of listeners, and I waited for the obvious 3-letter answer. Instead came a 5-minute incomprehensible explanation with numerous reservations. It was as though he was apologizing for the church's message. I know this is a part of the liberal kind of church landscape, but still. The reporter who pointed out he was a non-believer, he ended with the words, well, I don't know about you, dear listeners, but I certainly wasn't much wiser. It was incredible. Again, this is a communication problem. This is something we can do something with. Our responsibility is to make the gospel relevant for people in our time. The last part I want to cover in this section, and then I think the third afterwards, is 2 communications ditches. It's not that the church hasn't tried to tackle these problems and make itself relevant to a modern, partly post-Christians or pre-revival audience. It's that it's stuck in a ditch. But before we get into that, let's take a little time to consider this, because I meet people all over the place. There's lots of good work around different churches in different countries. And so many are both excellent at communicating the core message of the gospel to other people and to live out God's love and grace in words and deeds. I see it all over the place. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, my analysis is how the church as an institution manages to communicate the gospel, the core message of the gospel, and Jesus' standing invitation to people in general, the broader public, the people who normally don't care or attend church, right? Communication is difficult. Everyone who is married or knows about the question, that's not what I meant. What do you say, Lars? Never?
Totally unfit.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, of course. But for most people, for normal people, that is the question that arises somewhere. So, communication comes from the Latin word communicare, which means to make common. And in its simplest form, communication is a message sent via medium to a recipient. And the message is interpreted by the recipient, and the effect of communication is what's being heard, what is being received, decoded by the recipient. That's the effect of communication. And that is not always what people try to communicate from the sender, right? When the message isn't perceived, many get frustrated. They misunderstand what I'm saying. I hear that all the time in my profession. Clients are frustrated, and then they blame the receiver. And I say, is that your problem? Or is that people's problem? Or is it your problem? And I always say, it's your problem. It's your problem. In politics, we were sometimes frustrated with the voters who obviously didn't know their best interest because they voted for the wrong party. But you cannot blame people if we haven't conveyed something attractive to them. That's our problem. The church has tried to employ 2 main strategies, and as we'll see now, both have failed to communicate genuine, life-transforming grace and good news to people today. One ditch is to become like everyone else, try to fit in. This is kind of like the church I was describing previously or earlier. The Church of Norway has a big problem of being a chameleon church. And since the church notoriously adapts trends like 15 or 20 years after the mainstream society, the church looks like a parent awkwardly trying to use out-of-date slang with their teenagers' friends. This is how we get Christian organizations that are hard to separate sometimes from any humanitarian organization or a political party on the left side of the spectrum. They talk about climate, about social justice and materialism. I call this a chameleon church, when the church adapts its message to match ongoing trends and current issues at the expense of the unique core message that is the church's DNA. We find this in parts of the Church of Norway, as I already mentioned. I don't know what parts of the church that has those tendencies in your countries. We find it in parts of the academically oriented parts of the free churches, and most likely in some kind of liberal traditions in your countries as well. From a communication perspective, this is a death sentence for the church. The church's relevance truly doesn't lie in the timely, but in the timeless present. When the church is a chameleon, it doesn't speak about what's really at stake for every human being, the need for repentance, for salvation, and to confront our inner evil that has fully control over our lives until we are saved. If the church doesn't communicate that we are all traced in our egoism and need to be saved from ourselves, then the church becomes just one among many. Dallas Willard, one other of my heroes, he said, as Christians we know we should become like Jesus, so we try to act differently. Like going in these peace marches, for example. Trying to fly less plane because to save the environment. But changing our outward behavior doesn't change our hearts. Only God's grace can do that. So the church needs to communicate that very premise, because that's the unique premise for the church to have a voice in those topics. If we leave that out, we are a Red Cross or World Wildlife Foundation. That means if the church doesn't discuss how Jesus must first transform our hearts, then all the talk about climate and quickly becomes more legalism or moralism. And I think we have enough of that. For the audience, this is unclear. We don't see the difference between the church and others. And grace seems cheap, seems fluffy, and not very concrete. Far from what we learned in AA. This is obviously a branding problem. Lastly, in this section, I cover the next ditch that we have to come out of. This is no better. The other ditch is the Christians who, in fear of being too little Bible faithful or giving into the world's secular forces, tighten up even more notches in their condemnation of the less believing. I call this a turtle church. The church withdraws into a thick protective shell to shield itself from the terrible secular world out there. It becomes us and them, we who have seen the light, and most people out there who wander in the darkness, not knowing their own best interests. So we forget that we are all equal before God, and people, they notice that. They notice the wrinkling of the nose, and it so quickly in our time turns into a culture war. It sometimes resembles the Pharisees, and sometimes this seems like a very fear-based Christianity. We find this among preachers on the internet, among some free churches, conservative church podcasts, and very often among Christians who speak on behalf of Christianity on television. Communication-wise, this is also a death sentence for the church. The impression left with the public is that this is a bunch of joyless neurotics who are more concerned telling me what I should worry about than actually listening to what I worry about. They're more concerned about converting me than getting to know me. This is also a branding problem. People think that's not how Jesus met people, and I think they're right. As opposed to the chameleon church's cheap grace, grace without redemption, grace without the cross, the turtle church operates with some side of VIP grace. Or at least you can get some golden circle tickets. If you buy some pre-qualification, if you have the right sets of opinions in a handful of ethical, theological issues. Okay, so in an attempt to make itself relevant in our time, the church has devised two solutions. Either blend in society, the chameleon church, or go all in on self-righteousness, the turtle church. I think it's pretty evident that no one of those strategies has worked well. So what can we do instead? And I think that's what I would like to dig into in the learning community session afterwards. And I also prepared a couple of exercises for some group discussions covering the solution, how we can communicate the gospel clear and compelling to people in our time. There's nothing more important than that. These 2 decades I spent helping people communicate more with greater clarity and help them kind of connect with their own DNA. Why do they exist? Because that is, all the big brands are really good at that. Apple, for example, one of the most best established brand in the world, they're super tight on their core message. And every department of that company is so trained in that. And you notice that. The church is not a company, but some communications principles from the businesses is well worth noticing also for the church, because that is how we connect with the hearts of other human beings. So I spent I spent a lot of time analyzing what people are most worried about, like under the surface. And I don't think the average person either demands the chameleon nor the turtle church in our time. I think they want, or they demand the lion church. That is a church like Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia. Some of you probably know Aslan. It's the Turkish word for lion, Aslan. And it represents the good forces fighting against our evil nature. The lion church is where Jesus' life, death, and physical resurrection is communicated without reservation. It is a church that offers a personal relationship with Him, the way, the truth, and the life. And it's crystal clear that changing our heart and mind by Jesus being transformed from within, with Him, is the world's hope. When our hearts are changed, we can change the world. But it's always in that order. The classic popular spirituality in Europe is there's more between heaven and earth. And five people on the street told, what do you believe in? Do you believe in any spirituality of God? This is a classic answer. There's probably something more than between heaven and earth. Or another version is, I have a childlike faith, but I'm not very Christian. All kinds of spirituality that doesn't shape our lives. This is so similar to what Paul met when he spoke to the Athenians at the Mars Hill, Areopagus. They also worshipped an unknown God, just like people do today. And then Paul came with our core message, the good news that we have for people also today. What you worship as unknown, Paul says, this I proclaim to you. He's not far from any one of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being. In John 13, 34 and 35, Jesus gave us a new commandment. And I believe this is the best definition of our original brand. And every time that we as a Christian movement, by the grace of God and by the help of the Holy Spirit, reinforce some of what Jesus is telling about here, then we are inevitably relevant and attractive to a modern audience. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, says Jesus. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. I get goosebumps every time I read those verses. This is the essence of the Lion Church. That's what's turned the world upside down. That's what's going to turn the world upside down again. I fully believe in a revival. This isn't wishful thinking from my side. It's based on more than 20 years of analyzing people's deep concerns, what people actually care about the most under the surface today in our post-Christian culture. That's why I believe in a revival. But I also think that change first comes when we, as a Christian movement, radically rediscover what's always been there, our original brand. Let me close with the words of the American theologian Alan Hirsch. He said, when the church stops talking about Jesus, it has nothing to say. And I agree. But when the church talks about Jesus, it has everything to say.